In the last days of April 1945, when Berlin was already a labyrinth of ruins and the Reich had been reduced to disconnected fragments, Karl Dönitz, Grand Admiral of the Kriegsmarine and Supreme Commander of the German submarine fleet, knew the war was lost. Even so, he tried to control the only part of the military apparatus that still functioned in an orderly manner: the U-boats scattered across the North Atlantic, the North Sea, and the approaches to the Baltic. In those days of general collapse, submarine radio was still sending messages, logbooks were still being filled out, and commanders were trying to stay in contact with the base in Flensburg, where Dönitz had established his provisional command after the fall of Berlin. It was in this context that the last strategic decision of the submarine force began to be discussed: the order to voluntarily scuttle the entire fleet to prevent its capture. That order carried a code name that had circulated within the Kriegsmarine long before the war descended into chaos: Operation Regenbogen, Rainbow. The plan was not improvised. Since 1943, when the Battle of the Atlantic began to tilt decisively in favor of the Allies, Dönitz had considered the possibility that if Germany lost the war, the enemy would attempt to seize the most modern U-boats, particularly the revolutionary Type 21 and Type 23 submarines, capable of sailing for weeks underwater thanks to the snorkel and new battery systems. These were submarines that could have changed the naval balance had they entered service a year earlier. The Admiral knew he could not allow such technologies to fall intact into British, American, or Soviet hands. This idea of scuttling the fleet was not the first in German naval history. There was the precedent of Scapa Flow in 1919, when the officers of the Imperial Navy had sunk their surface fleet to prevent it from being divided among the victorious powers of the First World War. Dönitz saw that action as one of military honor and was willing to repeat it. In fact, some officers of the Kriegsmarine considered that it would be a humiliation for German submarines to be displayed as trophies in enemy ports. Sinking them was, in their view, the only dignified course. With the military situation collapsing on land, the operation was partially activated in the last week of April. The order did not circulate immediately throughout the fleet because Dönitz feared that a general message would be intercepted. Regional commands received fragmentary instructions, in some cases verbal, indicating that any vessels unable to escape to Norway should be destroyed. In the Baltic bases, the idea was already being put into practice. Several U-boats were sabotaged by their own crews before Soviet units captured the shipyards of Danzig and Gotenhafen. In the North Sea, by contrast, the orders were confusing, as many submarines were still on patrol or in transit toward resupply areas. On April 30th, while Hitler committed suicide in the Führerbunker, Dönitz assumed leadership of the Reich according to the political testament left by the dictator. Although he knew his authority was nominal, he did control the naval chain of command. It was then that he seriously considered issuing the General Regenbogen Order. The internal situation was desperate. Entire cities were falling under Soviet or Allied control, communications were breaking down, and the Luftwaffe no longer existed as an operational force. The Kriegsmarine was the only branch still maintaining discipline, and Dönitz feared that submarine chaos could trigger desertions or isolated decisions that would be difficult to reverse. On May 1st, in one of the final strategic decisions of the German Naval Command, a coded message was drafted for the fleet: prepare for the immediate scuttling of the U-boats in the event of surrender. The document included technical instructions: open flooding valves, detonate internal charges intended for self-scuttling, and ensure destruction of cryptographic equipment such as Enigma machines and codebooks. Commanders who received the notification began to move toward ports suitable for carrying out the plan, especially bases in the Baltic Sea and fortified shelters still in German hands. Many did so convinced that this was a final and irrevocable order. However, what followed was an example of the internal contradiction that governed the Third Reich in its final days. Dönitz himself, who had supported the idea of destroying the fleet to prevent its capture, realized that doing so without consulting the Allies could jeopardize his primary objective: negotiating a partial surrender that would allow hundreds of thousands of German soldiers to flee toward zones controlled by the British or Americans instead of falling prisoner to the USSR. In other words, destroying the U-boats might have sounded honorable from a military standpoint, but politically it could be perceived as an act of sabotage that would enrage the Allied High Command, particularly the British Admiralty. Pressure came directly from Field Marshal Montgomery and from British naval commanders in northern Germany, who sent envoys and messages insisting that the fleet be surrendered intact. Great Britain had followed with extreme interest the development of the new German electric submarines and wanted to capture as many as possible. Not only did they want to study them, they wanted to prevent the Soviet Union from receiving any in the post-war distribution. Dönitz, trying to buy time to evacuate troops from the Baltic, understood he could not risk a reprisal. On May 3rd, the turning point occurred. Early in the day, the counter-order was hastily drafted in Flensburg. It cancelled Operation Regenbogen and instructed all crews to prepare for surrender under strict prohibition from sinking the submarines. It was a decision that contradicted years of naval indoctrination and that, in some cases, arrived too late. In bases near the front line, especially in the eastern Baltic, several submarines had already been destroyed by their own crews. Others were in transit and never received the updated message. Some captains even believed the counter-order was false or the product of Allied interference, and they continued their self-scuttling preparations. Even so, most of the U-boats that were in ports in northern Germany or sailing toward holding positions received the counter-order in time. Commanders were bewildered. Within hours, they had gone from preparing to destroy their vessels to having to present them intact to the enemy. In some cases, explosives had already been placed and had to be removed, and in more than one submarine, cryptographic equipment had been destroyed before the order was reversed. As a result, several U-boats that surrendered to the Allies arrived without codes or sensitive technical material. The chaos of the last days of the war explains why Operation Regenbogen was only half executed, widespread enough for dozens of submarines to be deliberately sunk, but insufficiently coordinated to be implemented coherently. When German forces in the north capitulated to the British on May 4th, the U-boats that were still operational began receiving new instructions to head to Allied ports and formalize their surrender. Even then, tension did not fade. Radio channels repeated a warning: any vessel attempting to escape or scuttle itself would be attacked, and its crew considered in violation of the ceasefire. In the following hours, contradictory reports emerged. Some submarines reported sabotage attempts by sailors unwilling to surrender. Others reported minor mutinies in which officers forced the crew to accept the surrender. In a couple of documented cases, damaged submarines were scuttled by their captains before entering port, citing lack of seaworthiness. Although technically defensive, those sinkings were added to the long list of losses associated with the operation. By May 7th, when the German surrender was officially signed in Reims, Operation Regenbogen was already a confused memory. An order that had circulated, had been partially executed, and then cancelled under pressure. Many crew members never knew what had happened in the high command. They only knew that what had been presented as a final act of loyalty had been rescinded. When final reports were compiled, the Allies recorded more than 100 submarines deliberately scuttled by their own crews in the final days of the war. Others, meanwhile, were already on their way to their surrender ports. The mass surrender of German submarines in May 1945. The dawn of May 5, 1945, found the Atlantic in an uncanny silence, as if the shipping lanes that for years had been the scene of chases, torpedoes, and escorted convoys had suddenly become empty. In reality, they were not. Dozens of German submarines were beginning to slowly surface at scattered points across the North Sea, the North Atlantic, and the English Channel. They rose to the surface like creatures that had lived too long under the pressure of the ocean and were now surrendering to a world that no longer feared or needed them. It was the beginning of one of the most unique episodes of the immediate post-war period, the massive and orderly surrender of more than 150 U-boats in a matter of days. The official order had arrived the previous afternoon. The counter-order that cancelled Operation Regenbogen forced all crews to halt any attempt at self-scuttling and to prepare signals to identify themselves to Allied forces. From that moment on, each submarine had to navigate on the surface, broadcast in open code, and head to a specific port for its surrender. The British Admiralty set strict criteria. Those in the North Atlantic were to proceed to Londonderry in Northern Ireland. Those near the North Sea would be received at Loch Erebol, Scapa Flow, or Invergordon, and those near the English Channel would be escorted to Weymouth, Portsmouth, or Bristol. American units would receive some in Newfoundland or in ports on the east coast. Within hours, the shipping lanes filled with German signals transmitted openly, "We surrender." The Allies, surprised by the discipline of the submarine fleet, began organizing reverse convoys. Instead of warships chasing U-boats, it was the U-boats that sought escort to surrender. A British document from May 7th recorded a fact unthinkable just months earlier. Enemy submarine traffic en route to surrender is constant and requires coordination equivalent to a convoy. The visual spectacle was unprecedented. In the North Sea, several British destroyers noticed isolated points emerging slowly, like black smudges breaking the surface. When they approached, they found U-boats sailing in formation, their decks crowded with sailors at rest. Many had improvised white flags from bedsheets or torn uniforms. Others simply raised their arms or waved lamps. The British instructed that no one was to fire unless the submarines attempted to dive. The first documented mass surrender occurred at Loch Erebol on the northern coast of Scotland, an imposing natural harbour where mountains leaned over dark, deep waters. Beginning on May 10th, the first U-boats arrived there. The captain of HMS Onslaught described the scene as a funeral procession of iron, as more than a dozen submarines entered one after another, each with its crew assembled on deck saluting the British ships. It was the perfect image of the war's end at sea, but the surrender was not just a silent parade. Each arrival involved a meticulous procedure. As soon as a submarine entered port, it was surrounded by small vessels carrying armed British Marines. They immediately boarded, took control of the conning tower, and ordered the crew to form ranks on deck. German officers had to surrender their pistols and logbooks, while Allied technicians inspected the inside of the vessel to ensure there were no explosives or mechanisms prepared for scuttling. The priority was clear: prevent any last-minute sabotage that might destroy valuable technology. Many submarines arrived in precarious condition. They had gone days without maintenance, some with damaged engines or leaks that made surface navigation difficult. U-1009 surrendered with only one functional propeller. U-516 arrived escorted by a British destroyer after suffering a diesel failure midway. Others appeared with depth-charge damage, the result of the final anti-submarine attacks that took place even after May 4th. The war at sea had not completely ended. Until May 8th, several Allied commanders continued attacking U-boats that had not received the ceasefire order. The larger British ports also began to fill. At Scapa Flow, former graveyard of the scuttled Hoxie Flotte in 1919, dozens of submarines were moored side by side, involuntarily evoking the history of the Imperial German fleet. For British sailors accustomed for 6 years to thinking of U-boats as invisible enemies, seeing them now aligned, motionless and silent felt almost surreal. The port of Londonderry in Northern Ireland became the main reception centre. There, specialised teams were created to inspect, classify and guard the submarines. The Allies wanted to determine which units represented technological breakthroughs and which were obsolete models. Among them, the Type 21 boats, such as U-2511 and U-3008, stood out, arriving almost intact. The British were astonished by the submerged capabilities of these models. They could operate underwater at speeds that Allied destroyers could barely match on the surface. The technological shock was profound. The older submarines, by contrast, offered little interest. Some Type 7 and Type 9 units were sent directly to waiting areas for scrapping. Nevertheless, all of them had to undergo the initial inspection, which required the constant presence of interpreters and German technicians recruited by the British as temporarily retained specialists. Most crew members would later be sent to prisoner-of-war camps, but a small group was kept to help dismantle and operate systems that the British did not yet fully understand. The volume of surrenders was so large that the Allies had to improvise additional ports. In Weymouth, for example, local fishermen watched in astonishment as more than half a dozen U-boats were towed toward the coast. In some cases, the lack of fuel forced the submarines to navigate with improvised sails or request towing from the mouth of the channel. Not all arrived in good condition. A few had fungal growth in their batteries and leaks in compartments that smelled strongly of diesel. Meanwhile, the American fleet began receiving its own examples. In Newfoundland, 2 submarines surrendered after long-distance escorted navigation. American technicians were especially interested in the snorkel, a system that allowed German submarines to charge batteries while remaining almost completely submerged. For the US Navy, accustomed to submarines that had to surface fully to recharge, the discovery was of enormous strategic significance. But the most impressive aspect was not only the technology, but the discipline of the German crews. Despite the collapse of the Reich, many submariners maintained rigid, almost ceremonial behavior. They arrived in port in full uniform, with well-kept insignia, and surrendered their weapons and flags with formality. On U-2326, for example, the captain ordered the crew to assemble on deck and respond in German to each British instruction with a firm "Jawohl," as if the war had not ended. Several Allied officers recorded in their diaries that the professionalism of the submariners was as impressive as it was unsettling. Even so, there were incidents. In at least 3 documented cases, crew members attempted to destroy sensitive equipment just before Allied arrival. On U-1023, a small explosive charge placed in a communications panel was discovered in time. On U-1108, an officer erased technical manuals minutes before being removed. In other submarines, captains had thrown parts of Enigma machines or codebooks overboard. This created tension with the British, who had strict orders to prevent any technological loss. An exceptional case occurred with U-977, whose captain, Heinz Schäfer, decided to sail to Argentina instead of surrendering. This story will be explored later, but it illustrates the climate of uncertainty that accompanied the surrender. Not all commanders accepted defeat in the same way. On May 14th, barely a week after the German capitulation, the Allies had received 174 surrendered submarines. It was a colossal figure, all the more so considering that another 50 had been scuttled by their own crews in the preceding days. For Allied engineers, having such a volume of technical material at their disposal represented a unique opportunity to study, copy, and reinvent submarine warfare in the immediate post-war period. The most remarkable aspect is that this massive concentration of U-boats in British ports was unprecedented in modern naval history. The British ended up with so many German submarines lined up that they had to devise a visual code to avoid confusing them. Some were painted with large white numbers, others received specific markings according to their destiny: study, scrapping, or transfer to Allied powers. The assembly of that captured fleet was informally called by some officers the living graveyard of the Kriegsmarine. The fate of U-boats that never received the surrender order. The end of the war cast a long shadow over the waters of the North Atlantic, the North Sea, and the Baltic. Although more than 150 German submarines surrendered to British and American forces within days, a smaller but significant number fell outside any chain of command. Some were sailing too far afield, others were damaged, and some simply remained silent in an ocean now dominated by the Allies. These units, lost amid the confusion, played one of the darkest and most ambiguous roles in the final days of the war at sea: the U-boats that never received the surrender order, or chose to ignore it. The last days of April and the first days of May had turned the Atlantic into a space of saturated communications. Messages were repeated, interfered with, or arrived incomplete. Command in Flensburg, overwhelmed by the urgency of collapse, sent inconsistent instructions. The cancellation of Operation Regenbogen reached many units too late. Some submarines were so far away that their shortwave radios barely picked up fragments of transmissions. From the commander's perspective, the line between a genuine order and enemy interference was difficult to trace. One of the most famous cases was that of U-530, which was on patrol in the Western Atlantic when the war ended. Its captain, Otto Wermuth, claimed years later that he never received a surrender order from German Naval Command. The only signals he intercepted were Allied broadcasts demanding the immediate surrender of all submarines. For some commanders, accepting instructions from the enemy without confirmation from their own high command amounted to treason. As a result, U-530 chose to sail south, away from main shipping lanes, hoping to avoid attacks while deciding what to do. The case of U-977 under the young Captain Heinz Schäfer became legendary. This submarine was in the North Atlantic when fragmented news about the surrender arrived. Schäfer's official account maintains that he did receive the order but chose not to obey it immediately. His intention was to avoid falling prisoner to the British, a fate feared by many German submariners. There was professional respect toward the Royal Navy, but also deep resentment for the anti-submarine war, which had claimed the lives of over 30,000 German sailors. According to the captain's account, part of the crew requested a course toward Argentina, one of the few countries that maintained an ambiguous relationship with the Allied powers. where a German submarine might theoretically avoid immediate reprisals. Thus began one of the longest recorded post-war U-boat voyages, 66 days submerged using the snorkel, navigating almost entirely underwater, avoiding all contact until reaching the port of Mar del Plata in August 1945. This journey not only baffled Allied authorities, it also fueled theories that decades later would become persistent myths about alleged escapes of Nazi officials to South America. Not all U-boats that ignored or did not receive orders took such long routes. Some simply disappeared. U-869 was one of them. This submarine was lost in the Atlantic in February 1945, months before the war ended, but was officially considered missing near Gibraltar. However, when US divers found its intact hull off the coast of New Jersey in the 1990s, it became clear that its fate had been completely different from what German records indicated. The discovery demonstrated that even before the final collapse, misinformation and confused communications had created a persistent fog over submarine operations. A similar case was U-864, which was transporting military technology and strategic documents to Japan when it was detected and sunk by the British submarine HMS Venturer in February 1945. Although its destruction occurred before the capitulation, its secret mission remained hidden for decades, and its loss contributed to the list of submarines that, for reasons of operational silence, were left out of the official surrender chronology. More dramatic was the fate of U-boats whose commanders knew of the surrender order but decided to ignore it. These cases were exceptional but revealing of the psychological state of some officers in the final days of the Reich. For certain captains, scuttling their submarine or dying in combat remained preferable to surrendering alive. In some Baltic ports, especially in areas where Soviet troops were advancing rapidly, commanders knew that surrender offered no guarantee of survival. In that context, several submarines were deliberately scuttled by their own captains, not as part of Operation Regenbogen, but as a personal gesture of rejection of defeat. A clear example was U-3503, a modern Type 21, which, unable to break the Soviet encirclement in the Baltic, was scuttled by its crew near Gothenburg in May 1945. Swedish authorities partially recovered the vessel and documented the act as voluntary destruction, noting that the sailors chose to disable their equipment and abandon the submarine before letting it sink. The fate of U-1277 was similar. Its captain, asserting that he had not trusted any surrender orders received via radio, sailed his submarine to the coast of Portugal, where he scuttled it on June 3, 1945. The crew swam to shore, were interned by Portuguese authorities, and subsequently handed over to the British. The exact motivation for the scuttling is debated. Some argue the captain acted out of a sense of honor. Others suggest it was to prevent the submarine's capture due to fear of Soviet reprisals. What is clear is that he completely ignored orders to deliver the vessel intact. There were also submarines that never knew the war had ended. The geography of the Atlantic could turn an official message into a distant murmur filtered by interference and atmospheric disturbances. U-1023, for example, received confusing orders for days until it finally surfaced and was intercepted by British ships. In its logbook, the radio officer noted that he had heard multiple voices demanding surrender, but none came from German command. That lack of official confirmation was enough for the captain to delay compliance with any instructions. Some submarines traveled so far from Europe that it took weeks to realize that the war had ended. The vastness of the Atlantic included zones where communication was irregular. U-boats on missions to South America, Africa, or near the Caribbean were particularly vulnerable to being misinformed. When they finally appeared before US or British forces, their crews seemed disconnected from reality. They had spent days or weeks operating under strict routines without understanding that the conflict had concluded. Even after May 8th, the Allies continued recording ship sinkings caused by German submarines, unaware of the ceasefire. The most shocking case was that of the SS Blackpoint, an American freighter sunk on May 5, 1945, when the war in Europe was essentially over. The responsible submarine, U-853, ignored all ceasefire calls. It was pursued and destroyed by US ships off the coast of Rhode Island. Its wreck became one of the most visited by divers in the post-war period. In the end, the list of U-boats that never received the surrender order or that ignored it includes cases of confusion, isolation, desperate decisions, and individual acts that defied the logic of a collapsing regime. Many of these submarines disappeared silently without witnesses. The oceans swallowed them at a time when the war had formally ended, but where the consequences of chaos still lingered in every corner of the Atlantic. Meanwhile, other submarines, in an attempt to avoid capture, took extreme routes to remote ports in northern Europe, extending their final mission beyond the foreseeable. U-boats sent to remote ports to avoid capture. When German defeat became inevitable, long before the fall of Berlin, Naval Command had already anticipated that some U-boats would be unable to return to the Kriegsmarine's traditional bases without risking capture. Since 1944, when Allied bombing destroyed much of the fortified shelters in France, many submarines operating in the Atlantic had been forced to move northward to Norway, Denmark, and other remote Baltic facilities. These ports, far from the main front lines, became the final refuges of the German submarine fleet. There, a little-known drama unfolded: the attempt to preserve, hide, or at least secure certain U-boats before the capitulation. Norway was the center of this strategy. Since the 1940 occupation, the Norwegian coast had provided the Kriegsmarine with a chain of deep, narrow, and easily defensible fjords, ideal for concealing submarines. Underground facilities were constructed, such as the Bruno, Dora Rand, and Dora II bunkers, massive concrete structures designed to protect U-boats from British air raids. As Atlantic bases fell one after another, Brest, Lorient, La Rochelle, and Saint-Nazaire, the strategic importance of Norway grew exponentially. By the end of 1944, German command had concentrated over 100 submarines there, many under repair or being equipped. Among them were advanced Type 21 and Type 23 units, whose technology was so valuable that preventing their capture was deemed essential. Dönitz and his staff trusted that Norway could hold out for months after the fall of continental Germany, thanks to its difficult geography and fully stationed divisions still present there. For this reason, when the war ended, several U-boats received explicit or tacit orders to head to Norwegian ports. Some departed from the North Atlantic, others from the North Sea, and still others from the Baltic. The objective was not to continue fighting, but to retreat to a zone where the likelihood of an orderly surrender or a controlled voluntary scuttling was greater. One of the most important ports in this movement was Trondheim, where the Dora bunkers housed several next-generation submarines. There arrived, for example, U-2511, the first operational Type 21. Its captain, Adalbert Schnee, had received contradictory orders. On one hand, he was instructed to carry out final patrols against Allied convoys. On the other, he was told to avoid any situation that might result in capture. When the surrender became official, Schnee brought his submarine to Trondheim, where it surrendered without incident. The British, upon entering Dora front, were astonished by the level of engineering in the bunker and by the presence of several U-boats still in testing phases. Farther north, in Narvik, several submarines arriving from the Atlantic congregated. Some had narrowly escaped Allied air attacks. U-295, for example, arrived with bow damage and barely enough fuel to maneuver in the fjord. In Narvik, scenes unfolded that today seem cinematic. Submarines entering silently, at low speed, while Allied aircraft overflew the area without attacking, aware that a ceasefire was in effect, but unable to confirm which German units were complying with orders. Among the U-boats seeking refuge in Norway was U-530, the protagonist of the confusions described in the previous chapter. Initially, its captain considered heading to Trondheim or Bergen, but uncertainty regarding British troop presence led him to change course southward. This decision, combined with a lack of communication with German command, ultimately led to his famous voyage to Argentina. Denmark, for its part, received a smaller but significant number of submarines. The shallow waters of the Kattegat and Skagerrak posed risks as U-boats were vulnerable to detection and air attack. Nevertheless, some captains preferred ports such as Frederikshavn or Helsingør, where fuel depots and operational workshops still existed. For many, Denmark was considered a provisional destination while decisions about surrender or scuttling were made. Submarines that chose Danish ports often did so out of desperation. U-534, for example, was detected and attacked by British aircraft on May 5, 1945, just a day after the ceasefire order. The attack caused it sinking in the Kattegat Strait. Decades later, its recovery allowed the study of one of the last U-boats actively sunk during the conflict. In the Baltic, the situation was even more chaotic. U-boats attempting to reach remote ports such as Kiel, Flensburg, Hela, Warnemünde, or even small piers on Baltic islands faced advancing Soviet troops and a lack of reliable information. Some reached areas still under German control, others encountered ports already occupied by Soviet forces who captured the crews without hesitation. In certain cases, entire submarines became trapped between enemy lines or in ports without access to the open sea. One of the most dramatic episodes occurred with submarines trapped in the Gotenhafen area. Several U-boats stationed there received orders to retreat westward, but the Soviet advance was so rapid that many crews were unable to depart. U-11 was captured intact by the Soviets, while other U-boats were deliberately set on fire by their crews before leaving the piers. The scene at Gotenhafen was characterized by a mixture of military discipline and civilian desperation. Thousands of refugees attempted to flee while submariners destroyed documents, burned equipment, and opened flooding valves. In contrast, some U-boats reached surprisingly remote and little-known ports. In the Faroe Islands, a couple of German submarines surfaced unexpectedly, seeking temporary refuge before continuing to Norway. Local authorities under British control were forced to improvise reception measures as they had no military facilities to handle enemy submarines. There were even cases of U-boats attempting to hide in Icelandic fjords, though most were eventually detected by the Royal Navy. Extreme weather and lack of logistical support made sustaining these maneuvers for more than a few days virtually impossible. Throughout these movements, the objective remained the same: avoid immediate capture. Whether to preserve technology, protect crews from falling into Soviet hands, or simply comply with contradictory orders in a collapsing world, German captains desperately sought any remote port that could offer a last chance for maneuver. Most of these submarines would surrender days later, realizing there was no central German command left to support their resistance. Others, however, were captured by Allied forces, particularly British and Canadian, who played a far more active role in this process than is often mentioned. Canadian participation in the capture and evaluation of U-boats. Few stories from the immediate post-war period have been as underestimated as Canada's role in the capture, transfer, and evaluation of the U-boats that surrendered in May 1945. In historical imagination, it is often believed that the British Royal Navy and the United States Navy monopolized the management of captured German submarines. However, Canada played a crucial role in a phase that combined naval operations, technical intelligence, and complex maritime control logistics. The reason for this Canadian participation was written into geography itself. During the war, the city of Londonderry had served as one of the main bases for the Royal Canadian Navy. Entire escort flotillas operated there, responsible for protecting Atlantic convoys, one of the most important tasks for the Allied effort. These ships had experienced crews hardened by years of anti-submarine patrols. When the U-boats began surrendering en masse, the Canadians were in an ideal position to intercept, escort, and control them. Unlike other countries, Canada had a fleet obsessively trained in detecting and neutralizing submarines. The war in the North Atlantic had been their combat school. For this reason, when the British Admiralty received the first open code messages from surrendering U-boats, Canadian units were sent to intercept them. It was not a symbolic matter. The Canadians understood German submarine tactical behavior better than anyone and were trained to respond to any sign of deception. The first significant interaction occurred on May 10, 1945, when the Canadian destroyer HMCS Victoriaville intercepted U-889 in the North Atlantic. It was a meticulous operation. The submarine surfaced in view of the Canadian ship with its entire crew on deck, strictly following Allied instructions. The Victoriaville's captain sent a small armed boarding party to take control of the U-boat, inspect the hatches, and secure the torpedo compartment. Within minutes, the submarine was under Canadian control. U-889 proved to be one of the most valuable prizes of the war's end. It was a Type 9C/40, equipped with a snorkel with most of its systems intact. Canadian technicians were astonished by the quality of the German optical instruments, navigation systems, and electronic equipment on board. All of this would later be sent to Canadian laboratories for detailed analysis. A similar event occurred on May 13th when the Canadian destroyer HMCS Buckingham captured U-190. This submarine, responsible for sinking the Canadian mine layer HMCS Esquimalt weeks earlier, surrendered without resistance. For the Canadian crew, boarding it was more than an operational act. It was an emotional reckoning. Naval discipline prevailed, however. The U-190 crew was treated according to Allied regulations, and the submarine was escorted to Newfoundland for technical evaluation. A particularly symbolic scene took place upon its arrival in port. The Canadians hoisted their flag over the captured submarine, a gesture reflecting both victory and the importance the Royal Canadian Navy had acquired during the conflict. The submarine would remain in Canadian service for years as a training unit, demonstrating the practical value of the captured material. Canadian involvement was not limited to the initial capture. In London, Derry, where dozens of surrendered U-boats were concentrated, Canadians assumed tasks of inspection, temporary repair, and neutralization of hazardous mechanisms. A special team, under British coordination but largely composed of RCN technicians, was responsible for dismantling torpedoes, neutralizing explosives, and disabling systems that could pose a risk. This work involved real danger. On several submarines, charges prepared for self-destruction during the final days of April, when Operation Regenbogen was still active, were discovered. In one case, Canadian technicians found a partially armed demolition device in a battery compartment whose detonation could have destroyed the submarine and caused numerous casualties. The specialists' skill prevented the explosion. Canada's role also had a scientific component. Although the British and Americans retained the most advanced models, such as the Type 21, Canada had access to a wide variety of German equipment, including radars, hydrophones, and communication systems. Engineers from the National Research Council of Canada were sent to evaluate these devices. Their analysis directly contributed to the development of Canadian anti-submarine equipment in the post-war period and later during the Cold War. One of the most notable studies involved the German Balkongerät system, an advanced hydrophone that allowed more precise detection of Allied convoys. Canadian technicians were impressed by its sensitivity and began integrating some of its principles into their own sensor designs. Similarly, German batteries, more compact and efficient than Allied equivalents, were analyzed and partially replicated. Canada also participated in the escort and transfer of submarines to U.S. ports. Naval cooperation between Ottawa and Washington had been close throughout the war, and this technical link continued post-war. Several U-boats captured or surrendered under Canadian control were temporarily handed over to the U.S. Navy for evaluation, especially those equipped with snorkels. Canadian experience in anti-submarine warfare had been so extensive that many U.S. officers trusted their judgment to classify submarines by technological value. This explains why some units like U-190 were retained by Canada rather than sent to the United States or the United Kingdom. In certain cases, the Americans even requested Canadian support crews to operate captured submarines during the first weeks of inspection. But Canada's most significant contribution occurred on the operational level, managing the end of the Battle of the Atlantic. When U-boats began surrendering in large numbers, the maritime routes between Newfoundland, Iceland, and Northern Ireland fell largely under Royal Canadian Navy supervision. During a critical week from May 5th to 12th, Canadian ships escorted most of the U-boats to designated ports. It was a symbolic closure of a battle that Canada had fought for 6 years with a fleet that at the war's start consisted of barely a few obsolete destroyers. Canadian presence was also crucial to prevent fleeing submarines from attempting to reach open waters or uncertain destinations. In one particular case, a U-boat trying to divert south was intercepted by HMCS Moncton, which ordered it to change course under threat of fire. The submarine complied, confirming what many naval historians assert. In the final days of the war, the Canadians had operational capability rivaling that of any major maritime power. As the weeks progressed, Canada's role diminished, but its impact was already consolidated. When it came time to decide the final fate of captured submarines, Canadians participated in discussions with the British and Americans. Many U-boats were assigned to study, testing, or scrapping. Others would be deliberately sunk as part of an international operation. Submarines deliberately sunk by the Allies to balance naval forces. The mass surrender of U-boats in early May 1945 had filled British ports with a grotesquely silent fleet. Hundreds of submarines lined up, many still smelling of freshly burned diesel, others covered with the salt of long voyages. From a technological perspective, it was a perfect prize, but it also posed a major political problem. Under preliminary agreements among the Allied powers, all captured German submarines were to be divided between the United Kingdom, the United States, and the Soviet Union. It was precisely this last part, the delivery of strategic material to the USSR, that sparked panic in London. The Royal Navy was well aware of what an equitable distribution implied. The USSR would receive dozens of intact German submarines, including several equipped with snorkels, advanced sonar, precision optical periscopes, and batteries capable of sustaining long submersions. In other words, it would gain an immediate technological boost that could alter the post-war naval balance. By 1945, the Iron Curtain did not yet exist, but distrust certainly did. Churchill and the Admiralty were fully aware that the next threat would come not from Germany but from the East. Thus arose one of the most discreet yet decisive operations of post-war Europe, the Allied decision to systematically destroy the majority of captured U-boats to prevent Moscow from claiming them. The operation was given a cryptic name, Deadlight. Planning for Deadlight began just days after the end of the war in Europe. By late May, the British Admiralty had already gathered detailed information on the condition of each surrendered U-boat. Some were seaworthy, others required repairs, others were simply floating scrap. The submarines were classified into three groups. Group A, consisting of units considered suitable for navigation and technological testing. Group B, units that could be towed but not sail under their own power. And Group C, units too damaged to tow, destined for sinking in ports or nearby areas. Of the more than 174 surrendered U-boats, almost all were eventually assigned to Deadlight. The operation had a clear goal: sink the submarines in the North Atlantic, far from shipping routes in depths where recovery would be virtually impossible. The selected area lay about 100 miles northwest of Ireland, in rough seas where winds and currents made any future inspection difficult. Despite the strategic clarity, execution proved complicated from the outset. Many U-boats were in deplorable condition after weeks of neglect or partial sabotage. Some had corroded valves, damaged hulls, or inoperable engines. Simply reaching the sinking point was a logistical feat. The standard Deadlight procedure was theoretically simple: tow the submarine to the designated area, then open the flooding valves or detonate internal charges. If this failed, sink it by naval gunfire or air attack. But the Atlantic had other plans. The first group of U-boats assigned to Deadlight departed in November 1945. Weather conditions were so poor that several submarines sank accidentally before reaching the designated point. These premature sinkings generated tensions between the British and Americans, as some suspected that the Admiralty was deliberately sabotaging the international distribution, sinking units that were supposed to be handed over to the USSR. One of the most discussed cases was U-3514, a modern Type 21. During towing, a storm broke its mooring cables and the submarine slowly sank while British sailors watched without intervening. For the Soviet Navy, this incident was anything but accidental. The British Admiralty insisted there was no reason to doubt it, but the unease persisted for months. Another significant episode involved U-1407, also a Type 21. Fascinated by its technology, the British decided to recover and rebuild it for their own fleet. Instead of sinking it, they towed, repaired, and renamed it HMS Meteorite, using it for years as a test bed for alternative propulsion submarines. For the Soviets, this gesture confirmed their suspicions. The British only sank what they had no interest in keeping. But most submarines did not have such elaborate fates. The scene was repeated over 100 times. British ships towing rusted U-boats, battered by the waves, rocking dangerously until finally at the marked point they were sunk with almost surgical coldness. Sometimes, destroyers fired salvos of artillery to pierce the hull. At other times, RAF aircraft launched torpedoes to hasten the sinking. U-1105, famous for being one of the few coated with anechoic rubber designed to absorb sonar waves, was deliberately sunk to prevent the technology from falling into Soviet hands. The Admiralty justified the decision by stating that the material had already been properly studied. The USSR received only a minimal fraction of the promised U-boats, barely 4 or 5 units transferred directly from German ports in 1945. Most of these vessels were in poor condition, and none belonged to the advanced group of electric or experimental submarines. For the Soviets, it was a humiliation; for the British, a quiet diplomatic victory. One of the greatest ironies of Operation Deadlight was the contrast between Allied obsession with destroying the U-boats and the secret but evident fascination with the technology being destroyed. Engineers from the UK, United States, and even Canada spent weeks studying each system before authorizing its sinking. Zeiss periscopes, snorkels, high-capacity German batteries, rapid diving systems, and hydrodynamic rudders were copied and adapted for Allied submarines during the Cold War. Each U-boat sunk in Deadlight was, in reality, the visible end of a prior intellectual dismantling process. Everything that could be learned had already been learned, and everything that could give the Soviet Union an advantage had to disappear into the depths of the Atlantic. Political tensions between London and Moscow increased with each month of delay in delivering U-boats. In an internal report dated December 1945, a British admiral stated bluntly, "No advanced German submarine must fall into Soviet hands under any circumstances." And so it was. By mid-1946, almost all captured U-boats, more than 110 units, lay on the floor of the North Atlantic, some sunk according to plan, others allowed to sink through neglect or covert design. The ocean became their final grave. Meanwhile, their crews faced a very different fate: internment, repatriation, political re-education, and a harsh return to a devastated Germany. Life of the crews after surrender, internment, repatriation, and return to a ruined Germany. When the U-boats lined up in British ports, now silent hulls, without ammunition, without flags, and with their crews formed on deck, a completely different process began for thousands of German submariners than what they had imagined during the war. For many, surrender meant survival. The probability of death in the U-boat force had been the highest of any branch of the German military, with over 30,000 sailors killed, almost 70% of the total. But survival did not mean freedom. What followed was a long period of internment, transfers, interrogations, uncertainty, and slow personal reconstruction. The submariners' first encounter with defeat was always the same. Upon arrival at port, British Marines boarded the U-boats, ordered the crew to descend to the deck and line up. Officers immediately had their pistols, knives, documents, and precision watches confiscated. Radio operators had to surrender their codebooks and any cryptographic devices they had managed to preserve. The Allies feared sabotage even after surrender. On more than one U-boat, anti-boarding charges installed during the final days of April were discovered. Once the submarine was secured, the classification phase began. Sailors were transferred to Allied ships acting as provisional transports. Most were first taken to British ports such as Londonderry, Rosyth, Liverpool, or Portsmouth, where initial interrogations began. Officers underwent more detailed interviews, especially captains and chief engineers, since their technical knowledge was valuable for assessing the actual state of the German fleet. The interrogations were usually not violent. Unlike the Eastern Front, the British maintained strict protocols with prisoners of war. However, there was psychological pressure. Allied officers knew that many submariners had destroyed documents, sunk equipment, or tried to evade surrender. Questions about routes, ports, communications, snorkels, and anti-submarine tactics were constant. The goal was to collect as much information as possible before transferring prisoners to more organized camps. After the initial phase, crews were sent to POW camps in the United Kingdom. The most important was Camp 186 in Bridgend, Wales, where sailors and officers from various flotillas were concentrated. Other groups were sent to Farnham, Catterick, Featherstone Park, and other facilities across England and Scotland. Conditions varied. Although they were not physically mistreated, prisoners faced deep uncertainty. They did not know whether they would be repatriated soon, sent to work in agricultural or industrial areas, or transferred to other countries. Some feared being handed over to the USSR, a fate almost equivalent to a death sentence. Others were simply disoriented. The institution to which they had devoted their lives had disappeared overnight. In these camps, submariners faced inactivity for the first time. For years, they had lived trapped in the confined spaces of U-boats, sleeping in shifts, breathing diesel-laden, humid air, constantly facing attacks. Now, suddenly, they had beds, hot meals, and free time. Many felt uncomfortable in that silence. Some described it as a strange emptiness, less bearable than the daily fear of combat. Internal discipline was maintained. Submariners were, in general, the most cohesive troops of the Kriegsmarine. They continued making lists, cleaning shared spaces, and organizing sports activities. But tensions also arose. A small group of fanatics still defended the Reich, while the majority just wanted to return home. Repatriation was not immediate. In 1945 and 1946, hundreds of thousands of German prisoners saturated British and American camps. Logistics were complex, and the Allies wanted to ensure that no member of the submarine force was involved in war crimes or clandestine activities. Still, many submariners were repatriated ahead of other prisoners for a simple reason. The Allies had determined that U-boats, though devastating, had not committed systematic atrocities like some ground units. Submarine warfare followed technical logic more than ideological. A significant portion of the crews was transferred to Canada, particularly to camps in Ontario, Quebec, and Nova Scotia. There they spent months performing agricultural or forestry work, activities many recalled as oddly calming. The arrival of the Canadian winter, however, was a shock for men accustomed to European climates or the almost tropical heat inside a submarine. Meanwhile, the United States received smaller groups. Some submariners were taken to facilities in Virginia, Maine, and Florida, where they carried out manual labor or underwent extended technical interrogations. The Americans were particularly interested in sonar operators and electric engine technicians. For many of them, this was their first contact with civilian life outside Europe. Some described American treatment as distant but respectful. Others considered it more lax than the British. In any case, the goal of the interrogations was clear: learn as much as possible before allowing repatriation. Returning to Germany was a slow process. The first groups began to return in late 1946. They arrived in an unrecognizable country. Destroyed cities, millions of displaced persons, hunger, and a paralyzed economy. The Kriegsmarine had been dismantled, uniforms were prohibited, and any reference to the military past was viewed with suspicion. Reintegration was not easy. Many submariners had spent years under rigid discipline and had lived through extreme experiences. Returning to civilian life meant adapting to an occupied, divided, and morally defeated Germany. Most found themselves without employment, savings, or a clear place in the new society. Some tried to return to the sea as fishermen or merchant sailors, but the German maritime industry was devastated. Others worked in factories, reconstruction projects, or low-level state jobs. Some emigrated. Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Canada, and South Africa welcomed former submariners seeking a second life. Psychological pressure also left deep marks. Many ex-members of the submarine force suffered from claustrophobia, chronic stress, and depression. Submarine warfare was an extreme experience: months in tiny spaces, constant fear of being sunk, endless shifts, and the certainty that death could come without warning. In the post-war period, trauma was rarely discussed. Men were simply expected to move on. An uncomfortable and rarely addressed topic was political re-education. In several British and American camps, programs were implemented to denazify German troops. The intensity varied, from briefings on democracy to mandatory screenings of documentaries about concentration camps. Some submariners rejected these activities. Others experienced them as inevitable humiliations. But the most complex factor was fame. The submarine force had been portrayed in Nazi propaganda as a heroic elite. After the war, submariners became ambiguous figures, respected for their technical discipline, but also associated with the military machinery of the Reich. No one knew exactly how to behave in the new Germany. Everything changed in 1955 with the creation of the Bundesmarine, which opened an unexpected door. Several veteran submariners were offered positions in the new West German Navy, which sought to build a defense force within the NATO framework. For some, it was a return to the sea and an opportunity to rebuild their profession. For others, an uncomfortable reminder of a past they preferred to leave behind. The seizure of U-boats by France and their secret post-war use. When the war ended, European ports were filled with captured or surrendered German submarines. Most had been concentrated in British and American hands, but a third actor, silent and patient, was waiting for its opportunity: France. Devastated by the German occupation, with its navy weakened and military prestige fractured, France saw in the U-boats a chance to rebuild its naval power and regain international influence. What followed was a carefully managed process to appropriate German submarines and use them behind closed doors for decades. French interest in U-boats was not new. Since 1943, Free French naval intelligence, operating from London and Algiers, had closely monitored German advances in submarine technology. French engineers knew that Germany had surpassed the Allied powers in several areas: submerged propulsion, hydrodynamic design, and prolonged underwater endurance. In particular, the Type 21 and Type 23 models represented a technological revolution. Copying or reconstructing something similar from scratch would have taken France at least a decade. Capturing them directly was an ideal solution. In the initial allocation agreements, France had not been included as a direct beneficiary since its military status during the war had been ambiguous. However, Charles de Gaulle pressed hard during negotiations, arguing that a victorious nation should have a right to a proportional share of the German naval spoils. Finally, in 1946, France obtained authorization to receive several submarines, although the exact nature of this transfer was, and remains to this day, a matter of debate. The first major French acquisition came with the capture of U-123 and U-510, two Type 9 submarines interned in French ports reconquered by the Allies. Both were quickly inspected by British teams, but were later ceded to France as recoverable material. The French renamed them Morse and Millet, respectively, and began using them immediately for crew training and instruction. But these were just the first steps. The main objective of the French Navy was to acquire at least one fully functional electric submarine of the latest generation. This is where U-2518, a fully operational Type 21, came into play. The British, focused on their own studies, did not have the resources to operate all the advanced captured models simultaneously. France, maintaining close cooperation with the UK in naval matters, negotiated the transfer of U-2518 after guaranteeing it would be used exclusively for tests and not for offensive purposes, a promise that would soon be put to the test. When the submarine arrived in Cherbourg in 1946, French engineers were impressed. The vessel represented a complete breakthrough from anything France had built before the war. The U-2518 was faster underwater than on the surface, featured a hydrodynamically optimized hull for submerged navigation, and had high-capacity batteries capable of sustaining hours of continuous immersion. For the French Navy, this equaled a decade of technological progress in a single stroke. U-2518 was renamed Roland Morillot in honor of a French officer killed in combat in 1915. Its commissioning marked a milestone. France became the only country, apart from the UK and the United States, to actively operate a Type 21 submarine in the immediate post-war period. The Roland Morillot became a testbed for rebuilding the French submarine fleet. Deep dive tests, prolonged submerged navigation, torpedo firing, and nocturnal attack drills were conducted. Every piece of data was recorded, analyzed, and used as the foundation for future designs. The Roland Morillot's use also had a secret component. Officially a research tool, France employed it in several Atlantic patrol missions, some classified. In 1950, for example, the submarine participated in NATO convoy tracking exercises, testing US anti-submarine detection capabilities. To the surprise of many Allied officers, the former U-boat managed to approach protected areas undetected multiple times. France also received other smaller submarines. 3 Type 7 boats were transferred for experimental use, including U-4711, renamed Lauby. These submarines were not as advanced as the Type 21, but they were robust and easy to maintain, serving as training platforms for new generations of French submariners. Meanwhile, cooperation between French engineers and former Kriegsmarine members created an unexpected dynamic. Many German specialists, unemployed after the dissolution of the German Navy, accepted temporary contracts to work as technical advisors in France. Their knowledge of submarine electric systems, snorkels, and batteries was essential for fully understanding Type 21 technology. Officially, these advisors acted as civilian consultants, although their actual role was broader. In workshops in Toulon and Brest, former German crew and mechanics taught French engineers how to dismantle and maintain Siemens Schuckert electric motors, repair pressure joints, and modify internal compartments without compromising hull integrity. This knowledge was not a complete secret, but neither was it openly shared with France's allies. This accelerated learning allowed France to develop its own submarines directly inspired by German electric U-boats. Among the most emblematic were the Naval, Arethusa, and Daphne classes, all influenced to varying degrees by German architecture. Hull shapes, hydrodynamic lines, and internal layouts clearly reflected Type 21 designs. However, none of these advancements would have been possible without the appropriation of captured U-boats. France not only studied them, but kept them in service far longer than is publicly acknowledged. The Roland Morillo, for example, remained operational until the mid-1960s, long after the UK had retired its own Type 21 models. This prolonged use fueled diplomatic tensions. The United States believed France should fully align with standardized NATO technology, while Paris defended its naval independence. De Gaulle never fully accepted American oversight, and maintaining German technology was a way to preserve an independent development path. In 1963, when France began work on its future nuclear submarine program, many lessons learned from the Type 21 were incorporated into the first preliminary designs. French engineers noted in internal documents the decisive influence of electric U-boats on the hydrodynamic conception of nuclear propulsion submarines. While France consolidated its naval power using captured technology, Germany faced a radically different situation. After the defeat, it was absolutely forbidden to possess submarines, warships, or any infrastructure for building them. This prohibition, strict as it was, would not remain permanent. German reconstruction and the temporary ban on submarines, Germany. Without a submarine fleet, 1945 to 1955. The surrender of the Third Reich not only destroyed German military infrastructure, but also completely dismantled its maritime power. No other nation involved in the war experienced such an abrupt transition, from possessing the world's most feared submarine force to being legally reduced to a country without the right to design, repair, or build a single submersible. Between 1945 and 1955, Germany experienced an absolute naval vacuum. For 10 years, the industry, technology, and knowledge accumulated over decades seemed to vanish under the strict supervision of the victorious powers. The prohibition was formalized in the surrender documents signed in May 1945 and reinforced by the creation of the Allied Control Council, the body that governed occupied Germany. This council explicitly forbade the construction of submarines, the design of prototypes, the maintenance of existing units, possession of technical plans, and the training of personnel in submarine techniques. The word U-boat became associated with dangerous, politically unacceptable technology. For the Allies, the war in the Atlantic had been too costly to allow Germany even to dream of rebuilding its submarine fleet. Germany's naval industry was dismantled with surgical precision. Shipyards such as Blohm and Voss, Germania Werft, Deutsche Werke, Deschimag, and Havaltswerke were reduced to empty facilities or converted for civilian production. In some cases, the Allies physically destroyed launching ramps, dry docks, and specialized workshops. In others, entire machine tools were dismantled and sent as reparations to the United Kingdom, France, and the Soviet Union. But the most symbolic measure was the purging of human knowledge. Thousands of engineers, technicians, and naval designers were suddenly unemployed. Many were interrogated by the Allies, others emigrated, some found temporary work in mechanical or electrical industries, and a small group was recruited by foreign powers. In a curious historical twist, France and the United Kingdom employed former German engineers to maintain and study captured U-boats, while the United States and the USSR sought their expertise in secret to improve their own submarine fleets. Germany, however, remained officially paralyzed. The prohibition affected not only engineers but also sailors. Kriegsmarine veterans could not hold any position related to military navigation. The new European order aimed to prevent any resurgence of German militarism. Naval schools were closed, technical manuals confiscated, and naval libraries sealed. German submarine warfare, which had been a central component of the Reich's naval strategy during 2 world wars, became a closed, almost taboo chapter. However, unexpected tensions emerged in the shadows of this ban. Both the United Kingdom and the United States recognized that Germany possessed one of the most experienced naval engineering corps in the world. Even in a destroyed state, German industry remained synonymous with technical precision. With the onset of the Cold War, this expertise began to acquire value that few had anticipated in 1945. While the Western Allies sought to prevent Germany's military reconstruction, they also wanted to ensure that the USSR did not absorb all surviving technical talent. Several German engineers were invited to work temporarily on Allied programs. The line between restriction and utilization was thin and ambiguous. Nonetheless, the country was constrained. Between 1945 and 1955, there was no official German naval force. Germany was not even allowed to maintain armed coast guards or patrol vessels. Its ports were controlled by the Allies, and any vessel with military capability had to be dismantled. In 1949, with the creation of the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, the situation began to change, albeit slowly. The German administration sought to regain control of its territorial waters, but lacked any naval structure. Reconstruction had to begin from the civilian sector: ports, tugboats, fishing vessels, dredgers, and small merchant ships. It was a silent rebirth conducted under strict supervision. In parallel, the German Democratic Republic, East Germany, began forming maritime security forces under Soviet oversight. Although submarines were not mentioned, it was evident that German human capital remained valuable to all involved actors. The turning point came with the outbreak of the Korean War in 1950. The United States realized that a weak Western Europe was a strategic risk. They needed West Germany to become a reliable military ally within the new alliance system. Discussions then began regarding the creation of limited German armed forces capable of integrating into NATO's defensive structures. In 1951, the Bundesgrenzschutz Sea, BGSC, a reinforced coast guard, was formed. Officially, it was not a military navy, but in practice it performed basic naval functions: patrolling, coastal security, and search and rescue. Several former Kriegsmarine officers were discreetly recruited, though without military rank. The BGSC was the first clear sign that the absolute ban was beginning to erode. Meanwhile, German shipyards, which since 1945 had survived by producing agricultural machinery, civilian vessels, or industrial components, slowly began regaining technical capacity. Former naval design departments were re-established as civil engineering divisions, though in practice they preserved files and knowledge that had never been completely lost. A naval revival seemed inevitable, but one key aspect remained blocked: submarine construction was still strictly prohibited. Neither NATO nor the United States considered it prudent to allow Germany to operate a submarine force. The memory of the North Atlantic campaign remained fresh. The decisive change occurred in 1955, when the Federal Republic of Germany formally joined NATO. This accession implied military and naval obligations. The United States pushed for West Germany to participate in the defense of the Baltic and North Seas, which required anti-submarine capabilities, trained crews, and eventually the ability to operate modern submarines. Negotiations were complex. France openly opposed Germany regaining any type of submarines. The United Kingdom was more pragmatic, provided the German fleet was integrated into Allied structures. The United States, fully focused on containing the Soviet Union, supported a controlled revival of German naval capacity. Finally, in November 1955, the Bundesmarine, the new navy of West Germany, was officially established. Although its first units consisted of ships donated by the United States and United Kingdom, a Pentagon internal document stated that in the long term the Bundesmarine was to have a limited but effective submarine capability. This marked the first formal acknowledgement that the 1945 prohibition had ended. There were still no submarines, but the structure was ready. Naval schools and training centers had been built, engineers recovered from the civilian sector, and access to Western technology had been restored. The revival of the German submarine fleet, with the Bundesmarine, Type 201, 205, and 206 U-boats in the Cold War. When the Bundesmarine was founded in November 1955, West Germany was still not permitted to operate submarines, but discussions were already underway. The Cold War had reshaped the global order. The Baltic Sea had become a strategic arena between NATO and the Warsaw Pact. The Soviet Union deployed an increasing number of attack submarines each year, many derived from captured German technology, operating from bases in Murmansk, Lipacha, and Kronstadt. For the United States, the United Kingdom, and Norway, it was evident that an effective defensive line required a German presence on the maritime flank. West Germany possessed something no other NATO country had: a technical, not merely military, submarine tradition, and a corps of engineers capable of rebuilding capabilities from scratch. During the 1950s, several former designers from the Reich's shipyards, now employed in civilian industries, were discreetly consulted about reactivating naval projects in the new democratic Germany. Names were not publicized, but internal Ministry of Defense reports noted that most technical knowledge had survived the post-war period because it had been stored in workshops, offices, or even private notebooks. The challenge was significant. The Bundesmarine needed modern submarines but had to comply with strict rules. All German weapons had to be defensive and operate exclusively in NATO waters. Furthermore, the German state sought to avoid any symbolic association with the U-boats of the past. The revival had to be technical, not ideological. In 1959, the Bundestag officially approved the development of new submarines. The task was assigned to the Hauptwerke Deutsche Werft shipyards in Kiel, direct successors of some of the most advanced U-boat builders of World War II. This order marked the first real revival of a tradition that had been frozen for a decade. The objective was to create a completely new submarine, light, fast, quiet, and optimized for shallow water operations. Lessons from the war had shown that the Baltic Sea, narrow, saturated with sensors and full of natural obstacles, was a perfect environment for small, stealthy submarines. Germany was to build them not for oceanic crossings, but to defend a closely monitored, enclosed sea. The first tangible result of this revival was the Type 201, launched in 1962. It was radically different from the heavy U-boats of the past. Only 40 meters long with a submerged displacement of 450 tons, it was constructed entirely from a new non-magnetic steel designed to reduce detectability by mines and Soviet sensors. However, this non-magnetic steel also became the first major crisis of the new fleet. Although it reduced detection, it developed microfractures under diving pressure. In early trials, several Type 201 hulls showed alarming structural failures. The still young Bundesmarine, under international scrutiny, faced a dilemma: cancel the project or fix it quickly. They chose the latter. German engineers worked around the clock, redesigning the hull, reinforcing critical areas, and replacing parts of the experimental steel. This experience led directly to the Type 205, an evolution of the 201 that maintained its small-size philosophy but incorporated more reliable materials. Launched in 1965, the Type 205 became the Bundesmarine's first fully operational submarine. Its compact size made it ideal for covert missions in the Baltic Sea, maneuvering in areas where larger, heavier Soviet submarines could not operate without risk. Equipped with silent electric motors and advanced battery systems, it was extremely difficult to detect on short dives. The behavior of these submarines in the water surprised even Allied observers. A Norwegian document from the late 1960s described the Type 205 as extraordinarily quiet and maneuverable, comparable in stealth to a reduced Type 21. The reference was no coincidence. Although Germany had refused to directly copy the war-era electric U-boats, many of their hydrodynamic principles survived in the new designs. Type 205 submarines began patrolling the Baltic in the late 1960s. Their mission was not to attack but to detect, not to destroy but to observe. The Bundesmarine became a key component of Western surveillance of Soviet naval movements. From the Norwegian fjords to Danish waters, these small German submarines acted as silent guardians in a sea that could become a flashpoint at any moment. The real technological leap came in the 1970s with the introduction of the Type 206, a refined and more advanced version of the 205. Although visually similar, the Type 206 featured critical improvements: greater operational depth, more efficient batteries, modernized torpedo systems, and significantly reduced acoustic signatures. Acoustic stealth technology, perfected in Germany since the 1930s, allowed these submarines to operate virtually undetectable by certain Soviet sensors. The Tu-06's hull used improved non-magnetic steel, developed after years of research. Unlike the failed material of the Type 201, this steel was fracture-resistant while maintaining all the tactical advantages of the original design, invisibility to magnetic mines and low interference with naval sensors. By NATO standards, the Type 206 became ideal submarines for stationary surveillance missions and for subtle infiltration of enemy waters. Their tactical role was specific yet critical. In the event of war, the Tu-06s were expected to position themselves in strategic Baltic zones to detect Soviet submarines attempting to access the North Sea or disrupt NATO convoys. Small but precise as scalpels, they could hide in bays, irregular seabeds, or even among traffic routes. The Bundesmarine trained entire generations of submariners on these units. Unlike the Kriegsmarine, whose training was extreme and sacrifice-oriented, the Bundesmarine adopted a professional, technical approach. New submariners were trained in modern schools, with naval physics, electrical engineering, and stealth operations as central pillars. The collective trauma of massive World War II losses had made German commanders proponents of a completely different doctrine: precision, not audacity; survival, not fanaticism. During the 1970s and 1980s, Type 206 submarines carried out silent missions rarely appearing in official reports. They observed Soviet naval exercises, tracked diesel-electric submarines of the Warsaw Pact, inspected underwater cables, and documented movements transmitted to NATO centers. On multiple occasions, a 206 positioned itself meters away from a Soviet submarine without being detected, a feat made possible by its compact size and exceptional mechanical silence. The success was such that several NATO countries pressured for similar models. Israel acquired Type 206 derivatives adapted to its needs, while South Korea and Turkey purchased later versions. Once prohibited, German naval engineering became a reference for mid-sized conventional fleets. Perhaps the most remarkable fact is that Type 206 submarines remained operational until 2010, becoming one of the longest-serving post-war submarine lines in Europe. Their durability and efficiency confirmed that the German submarine revival was not symbolic, but a complete and technologically competent return, a return that began with a country forbidden from building submarines and ended with Germany exporting some of the world's most advanced conventional submersibles.